The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting them for weeks. Mom, honestly, we'd all be better off if you were just gone. My daughter Jessica's voice carried through the phone with the kind of cold finality that comes from years of built-up resentment. I was standing in my cramped studio apartment kitchen, holding a cup of instant coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring out at the rain-soaked parking lot of the Riverside Manor complex where I'd been living for the past 8 months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Jessica's words shouldn't have surprised me. After all, my 3 children had made their feelings about me crystal clear during our last family gathering, if you could even call it that. It had been Tyler's birthday dinner at an upscale restaurant I couldn't afford, where I sat at the end of the table like an unwanted guest, while my successful children discussed their careers, their investments, their vacation plans, to places I'd never see. When the check came, they'd split it 3 ways and left me to figure out my own portion, watching with barely concealed irritation as I counted out crumpled bills from my worn purse. "You're embarrassing, Mom," my youngest son Marcus had whispered harshly as I fumbled with the money. "Look at yourself. Look at how you live. We've all tried to help you, but you refuse to get your act together." The sting of those words still burned, even though it had been 3 weeks since that disastrous dinner. My children saw me as a failure, a burden, a woman who had squandered every opportunity life had given her and now expected them to clean up the mess. If only they knew the truth. What my children didn't know, what nobody knew, was that their apparently destitute mother was worth approximately $12.7 million. Not in stocks or bonds or real estate they could trace, but in carefully hidden assets accumulated over 30 years of meticulous planning and strategic deception. Every time Jessica rolled her eyes at my secondhand clothes, every time Tyler made a snide comment about my lifestyle choices, every time Marcus suggested I should consider assisted living because I was becoming too much of a burden, I thought about the offshore accounts, the cryptocurrency wallets, the precious metals stored in safety deposit boxes across 3 states. My name is Eleanor Whitman, though my children have taken to calling me Ellie when they bother to call at all, like I'm some elderly aunt they're obligated to check on rather than the woman who gave birth to them and raised them for 18 years each. I'm 62 years old, and according to my children, I'm a cautionary tale about what happens when someone makes poor life choices and refuses to take responsibility for their circumstances. According to their narrative, I'm the mother who never quite got her life together after their father left, who bounced between minimum wage jobs and cramped apartments, who showed up to their graduations and weddings looking shabby and out of place among their successful friends. The irony is almost beautiful in its cruelty. While my children climbed their respective corporate ladders, achieving the kind of conventional success that looks impressive on paper, I was building something they couldn't even comprehend. 25 years ago, when they were still in high school and college, dismissing me as just another suburban housewife with no real ambitions, I started my first business. It was nothing glamorous, just a small cleaning service that I ran out of our garage while their father worked his steady but unremarkable job at the insurance company. What started as a way to bring in extra money for their college tuition became something much larger. I had an eye for opportunity that none of them inherited, despite their expensive educations and professional achievements. While they learned to follow corporate hierarchies and climb predetermined ladders, I learned to create my own path. The cleaning service led to property management, which led to real estate investments, which led to a network of businesses that generated passive income while I maintained the facade of struggle. The facade wasn't entirely false in the beginning. Those early years were genuinely difficult, working 16-hour days to build something from nothing, while their father grew increasingly resentful of my ambitions. Richard wanted a traditional wife who would be satisfied with his modest income and predictable life. He wanted dinner on the table at 6 and a wife who found fulfillment in PTA meetings and neighborhood book clubs. Instead, he got a woman who saw potential everywhere and refused to accept that our circumstances were permanent. When Richard finally left us, announcing that he'd found someone who appreciated him and didn't make him feel inadequate with her relentless drive, my children blamed me entirely. They were old enough to understand that marriages end, but young enough to believe that if I had just been a better wife, a more traditional mother, their father would have stayed. They saw my business ventures as selfish pursuits that had destroyed their family, never understanding that I was building security for all of us in a world where depending on someone else's income was a luxury I couldn't afford. Jessica was 17 when her father left, already accepted to Northwestern on a partial scholarship that I had supplemented with money from my growing business empire. But instead of gratitude, she showed resentment. "If you hadn't been so obsessed with your stupid businesses, Dad wouldn't have left," she'd accused me during one of our few honest conversations. "You cared more about making money than about our family." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth that I couldn't explain to her. I did care about making money, but not for the reasons she assumed. I had grown up watching my own mother depend entirely on my father's income, seen how vulnerable that dependence made her when he died unexpectedly, and left her with nothing but Social Security and a mortgage she couldn't pay. I had sworn that would never happen to me, that I would never be at the mercy of someone else's financial decisions or life circumstances. But explaining that to Jessica would have required admitting that I didn't trust her father to provide long-term security, that I had seen the signs of his dissatisfaction years before he acted on them. It would have meant shattering her idealized view of her parents' marriage and forcing her to confront the reality that love doesn't pay the bills or guarantee anything beyond the present moment. So instead, I let her blame me for the divorce and focused on building the kind of wealth that would ensure my children never experienced financial insecurity, even if they never knew I was the one providing that security. Tyler was 15 when the divorce became final, old enough to understand the financial implications, but young enough to believe that money was something that just appeared when needed. He watched me move us from our comfortable suburban home to a smaller apartment, saw me trade the SUV for a reliable but modest sedan, witnessed the cutbacks that came with transitioning from 2 incomes to 1. What he didn't see was that these changes were choices, not necessities. I could have maintained our lifestyle easily with the income from my businesses, but doing so would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer. The smaller apartment was actually an investment property I had purchased 6 months before the divorce, knowing that Richard would expect me to struggle financially in his absence. The modest car was paid for in cash, though I let Tyler believe I was making payments that stretched my budget. The cutbacks were strategic, designed to maintain the narrative that his father's departure had left us financially vulnerable, while actually allowing me to accelerate my wealth building without drawing attention to my success. Marcus was only 13, young enough that the changes in our lifestyle felt normal rather than temporary. He adapted to the new apartment, made friends with the neighborhood kids, seemed largely unaffected by the shift in our circumstances. But as he grew older, he began to internalize the story that his mother was someone who couldn't quite manage her life properly, someone who made do but never thrived.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
By the time he graduated high school, he had developed the same subtle condescension toward me that his siblings displayed, a mixture of affection and pity that suggested they saw me as well-meaning, but fundamentally incompetent. The most painful part wasn't their attitude toward my apparent circumstances, but their complete inability to recognize the intelligence and drive that had created their opportunities in the first place. Jessica graduated from Northwestern debt-free because I had quietly paid the portions of her tuition that scholarships didn't cover, funneling money through an educational foundation I had established years earlier. She believed she had earned her debt-free status through academic merit alone, never questioning how a single mother working cleaning jobs had managed to cover the remaining costs. Tyler attended MIT for engineering, an expensive education that should have been impossible on my apparent income. But I had been contributing to a $529 education savings plan since he was born, adding money systematically while maintaining the appearance of living paycheck to paycheck. When it came time for college, the funds were there, seemingly the result of careful budgeting and sacrifice rather than strategic wealth accumulation. Tyler appreciated that I had managed to save for his education, but he saw it as evidence of my devotion rather than my competence. Marcus went to Stanford for business, ironic, given that he remained completely oblivious to the business acumen that had funded his education. By the time he graduated, I had perfected the art of appearing grateful for his advice about my finances, while secretly managing a portfolio that generated more passive income in a month than he earned in a year at his entry-level consulting position. He would lecture me about budgeting and savings, recommending basic financial planning strategies that I had mastered decades before he was born. The hardest part of maintaining my facade wasn't the financial restrictions or the judgment from my children. It was watching them develop into the kind of people who measured worth entirely by visible success, who assumed that someone's circumstances reflected their capabilities rather than their choices. They had become everything I had worked to protect them from becoming: entitled, superficial, and completely disconnected from the reality of what it takes to build something from nothing. Jessica worked in marketing for a Fortune 500 company, earning a six-figure salary that she spent maintaining a lifestyle designed to impress rather than fulfill. She lived in a downtown loft that cost more per month than I had spent on housing in years, drove a luxury car she couldn't really afford, and worried constantly about keeping up with colleagues who came from generational wealth. She had become exactly the kind of person who judges others by their possessions and assumes that financial struggle indicates personal failure. Tyler had parlayed his engineering degree into a career in tech, working for a startup that might or might not survive its next funding round. He made good money but spent it as quickly as he earned it, convinced that his earning potential was unlimited and that planning for setbacks was unnecessary. He had never experienced real financial insecurity, never had to make genuinely difficult choices about money, never developed the kind of resilience that comes from building something yourself rather than receiving it as a gift. Marcus had chosen consulting specifically because it offered prestige and the promise of rapid advancement, but he had no real understanding of how businesses actually function beyond the theoretical frameworks he had learned in school. He could analyze market trends and recommend strategies for companies he'd never worked in, but he had never created value from nothing, never risked his own resources on an uncertain outcome, never experienced the satisfaction of building something that exists solely because of your own vision and effort. All three of them had succeeded according to conventional metrics, but they had also become the kind of people who would dismiss their own mother as a failure because she lived in a modest apartment and shopped at discount stores. They had inherited my intelligence, but none of my wisdom, my ambition, but none of my perspective, my drive, but none of my understanding of what actually matters in life. The apartment I lived in was another investment property, one of 17 I owned in the metro area through various LLCs and holding companies. The modest furnishings and second-hand clothes were choices, not necessities, part of a carefully constructed persona that allowed me to move through the world unnoticed and underestimated. The beat-up Honda I drove was reliable and efficient, and it never occurred to anyone that I could afford something much more expensive if I wanted it. But the real reason I maintained this facade had evolved over the years, from a practical necessity to something more complex. In the beginning, I had hidden my wealth to protect it from Richard during the divorce proceedings, to avoid alimony obligations that would have rewarded him for leaving, to maintain control over assets I had built independently. Later, I continued the deception to protect my children from the kind of entitlement that destroys ambition and character. I wanted them to earn their own success, to develop their own sense of accomplishment, to understand the value of work and achievement. By the time they were adults, I realized that the secrecy had become its own kind of test. Would my children love and respect me regardless of my apparent circumstances? Would they value our relationship for what it was, rather than what I could provide? Would they demonstrate the kind of character that would make them worthy of the wealth I had accumulated for their benefit? The answer, it turned out, was no. My children had failed a test they didn't even know they were taking, revealing themselves to be exactly the kind of people who measure love by financial contribution and respect by social status. They cared about me only to the extent that I didn't embarrass them, tolerated my presence only when it was convenient, and made it clear that they considered me a burden they were obligated to bear, rather than a person they valued for her own sake. The final test had come 8 months ago when I had deliberately moved to the Riverside Manor complex, a modest apartment building in a working-class neighborhood that was clean and safe, but clearly several steps down from where they thought I should be living. I had told them that I couldn't afford my previous apartment anymore, that I needed to downsize to make ends meet, that I might need to consider more drastic changes if my financial situation didn't improve. Their response had been exactly what I expected, and everything I had hoped I was wrong about. Instead of offering to help, they had lectured me about budgeting. Instead of inviting me to stay with one of them temporarily, they had suggested I look into senior housing options. Instead of treating the situation as a temporary setback that family members help each other overcome, they had treated it as evidence that I was finally facing the consequences of my poor life choices. The conversation with Jessica that morning had been the culmination of months of increasingly strained interactions. She had called to tell me that she, Tyler, and Marcus had been discussing my situation, and they had agreed that I needed to make some serious changes if I expected to maintain a relationship with them going forward. They were tired of worrying about me, tired of making excuses for my circumstances to their friends and partners, tired of feeling guilty about their own success when I was obviously struggling. "We think it would be better for everyone if you just figured things out on your own for a while," Jessica had said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she used when she thought she was being kind but firm. "We love you, Mom, but we can't keep enabling your poor choices. Maybe if you hit rock bottom, you'll finally get motivated to turn your life around." Rock bottom. My daughter thought that watching me hit rock bottom would somehow motivate me to improve my life. She had no idea that I was already standing on a foundation more solid than anything she had ever built, that her perception of my circumstances was as carefully constructed as the business empire that supported it, that the mother she pitied for her lack of ambition had achieved a level of financial independence that none of them could imagine. "Maybe you're right," I had said quietly, setting down my cold coffee and walking to the window of my modest apartment. "Maybe I do need to figure things out on my own." "We knew you'd understand," Jessica had replied, relief evident in her voice. "This doesn't mean we don't love you. It just means we need some space while you get your life together. When you're ready to make some real changes, we'll be here for you." After hanging up, I stood at my kitchen window for a long time, watching the rain create patterns on the glass and thinking about the children I had raised and the adults they had become. For 30 years, I had built wealth not for my own satisfaction, but for their security. I had sacrificed the recognition and respect that comes with visible success so that they could have opportunities without obligation, education without debt, a safety net they never knew existed, and in return they had decided that I was better off dead. The phrase echoed in my mind as I moved through my apartment, looking at the space I had chosen specifically because it would reinforce their perception of my circumstances. The furniture was clean but dated, purchased from estate sales and consignment shops not because I couldn't afford better, but because it supported the narrative I had carefully constructed. The kitchen appliances were basic but functional, the kind of replacements someone makes when their old ones break and they can't afford upgrades. The decorations were minimal and generic, suggesting someone who had given up on making her living space reflect her personality or aspirations. But behind this carefully constructed facade, I had access to resources that could change my life or theirs in an instant. The laptop sitting on my small dining table looked like something someone might buy at a discount electronics store, but it was connected to accounts and investments that generated more money while I slept than my children earned in months of conventional employment. The phone they called to deliver their ultimatum was a basic model that could have been replaced with the latest technology without me noticing the expense, but I chose to maintain the appearance of someone who made every purchase carefully and reluctantly. The bank statements scattered across my coffee table told the story my children expected to see. A checking account with a modest balance, a savings account that seemed to shrink every month, credit card bills for basic necessities that took most of my apparent income to service. But these accounts represented only the tip of an iceberg, the visible portion of financial resources that remained deliberately hidden from everyone who thought they knew Eleanor Whitman. The real Eleanor Whitman owned commercial real estate in 4 states, had investment accounts that weathered market downturns without affecting her lifestyle, held cryptocurrency that had appreciated beyond anything her conventionally minded children could have predicted. She had diversified her wealth across asset classes and geographic regions, protected it with legal structures that would survive her death, and benefit people who might or might not deserve that generosity, depending on choices they made without knowing they were being evaluated. That evening, I called my attorney, Richard Blackwood, from my secure phone line. Richard was one of the few people who knew the full extent of my wealth, having helped me structure the legal entities that protected it over the years. He was also someone who understood the psychology behind my decision to hide my success from my children, having witnessed similar family dynamics among his wealthy clients. "Eleanor," Richard said when he answered, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had become a friend as well as an advisor over the years. "How are you holding up? I know this situation with your children has been weighing on you." "They've made their position clear," I said, walking to the window of my apartment and looking out at the parking lot where my neighbors were coming home from jobs that probably paid less in a year than I made in passive income each month. "Jessica called this morning to tell me they've decided I'd be better off dead." Not in so many words, but the message was unmistakable. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I know how much you hoped they would surprise you." "Part of me is relieved," I admitted. "The test is over. The question is answered. Now I need to decide what to do with that information." Richard was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him considering his response carefully. As my attorney, he was bound by confidentiality. But as someone who had watched me build my wealth over 2 decades, he also understood the emotional complexity of my situation. "Have you given any thought to your next steps?" "I've been thinking about it for months," I said. "If my children believe they'd be better off without me, maybe it's time to let them find out what that actually means. Not my death, obviously, but my complete absence from their lives. Let them discover who they are and what they can accomplish when they can't blame their circumstances on their disappointing mother." "That's a significant decision," Richard said carefully. "Are you considering relocating?" "I'm considering disappearing entirely. New city, new identity, new life. Let Eleanor Whitman become someone who exists only in their memories, while I start over somewhere else as someone who doesn't have to hide her success or apologize for her ambitions." The idea had been forming in my mind for weeks, crystallizing into a plan that felt both terrifying and liberating. If my children wanted to be rid of their burdensome mother, I could give them that gift more completely than they could imagine. But instead of dying and leaving them to inherit wealth they had never appreciated, I could simply vanish and take my resources with me. Let them build their own lives without the safety net they had never known existed. Let them discover what true independence actually requires. "Where are you thinking of going?" Richard asked. "Somewhere warm," I said, though I had already been researching coastal cities in Florida and California. Places where a wealthy widow could blend into communities of other successful retirees without attracting attention. Somewhere I can be myself for the first time in 30 years. "What about your assets here? Your properties, your businesses?" "Most of them can be managed remotely or sold without affecting my overall financial position. The real estate holdings in particular have appreciated beyond anything I expected when I started acquiring them. I could liquidate everything here and reinvest elsewhere without reducing my net worth." "And your children? Will you tell them the truth before you leave?" I considered the question as I watched a young mother in the parking lot below struggling to carry groceries and manage 2 small children simultaneously. She reminded me of myself 30 years ago, overwhelmed by responsibilities and determined to create something better for the people she loved, even if they never fully understood or appreciated the sacrifice involved. "I don't think they've earned the truth," I said finally. "They've made it clear that they judge people by their circumstances rather than their character. If I revealed my wealth now, they'd suddenly become loving and attentive. But it would be the money they loved, not me. I'd rather they remember me as the disappointing mother they were ashamed of, than discover they spent years despising someone they should have respected." "That's a hard choice, Eleanor." "It's the choice they made for me when they decided I'd be better off dead." After ending the call with Richard, I spent the evening researching my options for disappearing completely. It wasn't difficult to find information about starting over in a new place with a new identity, especially when you had the financial resources to do it properly. Unlike people who disappeared to escape debt or criminal charges, I had the luxury of planning carefully and taking my wealth with me. The process would take several months to execute properly. I would need to gradually liquidate my assets here, transfer funds to accounts in my new location, establish residency somewhere else, and create a believable backstory for Eleanor Whitman's disappearance that wouldn't trigger missing person investigations or insurance fraud suspicions. But with careful planning and Richard's legal expertise, it could be done in a way that left no loose ends or unanswered questions. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the sounds of the Riverside Manor complex settling around me, I thought about the woman I had become over the past 30 years, and the woman I could be if I stopped hiding my success from people who didn't deserve to benefit from it. For decades, I had defined myself primarily as a mother, making decisions based on what I believed was best for my children, even when they couldn't understand or appreciate those choices. But my children were adults now, successful in their own right, capable of managing their lives without my protection or guidance. They had made it clear that they didn't want my involvement in their lives, unless I could transform myself into someone they wouldn't be embarrassed to claim as family. They wanted a mother who fit their image of respectability, someone whose circumstances reflected well on their own success, someone who validated their worldview rather than challenging it. The Eleanor Whitman they wanted me to become would be grateful for their attention, apologetic about her circumstances, eager to accept their guidance and advice about how to improve her life. She would be someone who made them feel generous and wise, who provided opportunities for them to demonstrate their superiority without requiring anything meaningful in return. She would be a character in their story rather than the author of her own. But the real Eleanor Whitman was someone entirely different. She was a woman who had built wealth through intelligence and determination, who had created opportunities rather than waiting for them to appear, who had succeeded in ways her children couldn't imagine despite hiding that success for their benefit. She was someone who had earned the right to live openly and honestly, to enjoy the fruits of her labor without apology or explanation, to surround herself with people who appreciated her for who she was, rather than what she could provide. The decision to disappear wasn't really about punishing my children for their lack of appreciation, though there was certainly an element of poetic justice in letting them experience life without the safety net they had never acknowledged. It was about finally claiming the right to be myself fully and completely, without the restrictions imposed by maintaining a facade that had outlived its purpose. If Jessica, Tyler, and Marcus believed they would be better off without their disappointing mother, I was about to give them the opportunity to prove it. And I was about to discover what it felt like to live as the person I had always been underneath the carefully constructed image of struggle and limitation. The test was over, and everyone had failed except me. Now it was time to collect my reward. 3 weeks after Jessica's devastating phone call, I was sitting in a coffee shop in downtown Seattle, wearing clothes that actually reflected my financial status for the first time in decades. The cashmere sweater and tailored slacks weren't flashy, but they were well-made and expensive, the kind of understated luxury that whispers rather than shouts. I was meeting with Caroline Mitchell, a relocation specialist who helped wealthy individuals transition to new lives in different cities when circumstances required complete anonymity. Caroline looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for a high-end personal consultant. Elegant, professional, with silver hair pulled back in a chignon, and the kind of confidence that comes from solving complex problems for people who can afford the best solutions. She had been recommended by Richard Blackwood, who assured me that Caroline's discretion was absolute and her success rate was perfect. "Mrs. Whitman," Caroline said as she settled into the chair across from me, her voice carrying the neutral accent of someone who had learned to adapt to any social environment. "Richard has briefed me on your general situation, but I'd like to understand your specific goals for this transition. Are you looking to relocate temporarily or permanently?" "Permanently," I said without hesitation. "Eleanor Whitman needs to disappear completely, and someone new needs to take her place somewhere else entirely." Caroline nodded, as if this was the most natural request in the world. "Do you have a preference for your new location, climate, lifestyle, proximity to cultural amenities?" "Somewhere warm, near the ocean. I've spent 30 years in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm ready for sunshine and beaches. But more importantly, I want to be somewhere I can live openly as someone with substantial wealth, without anyone from my former life accidentally discovering me." "Florida and Southern California are popular choices for our clients in your situation," Carolyn said, making notes on a tablet that looked more expensive than most people's computers. "Both offer communities where affluent retirees can blend in comfortably, excellent infrastructure for managing assets remotely, and enough social opportunities to build a completely new network if you choose to." The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering everything from the logistics of transferring assets to the psychology of assuming a new identity. Caroline explained that the key to successful disappearance wasn't just changing your name and location, but transforming your entire lifestyle and social circle so completely that even people who had known you for years wouldn't recognize the person you became. The challenge, Caroline explained, is that most people underestimate how much of their identity is tied to their relationships and circumstances. When you remove those anchors, you need to be prepared for a period of disorientation that can be quite unsettling, even when the change is voluntary. I've been living a false identity for 30 years, I told her. I think I can handle being authentic for a change. Caroline smiled at that, the first genuine expression I'd seen from her during our meeting. In that case, you may find this transition easier than most of our clients. People who have been hiding their true selves often discover that authenticity is remarkably liberating, even when it requires leaving everything familiar behind. By the time our meeting ended, I had signed a contract for Caroline's services and made a down payment that would have covered my apparent living expenses for 3 years. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was spending more money on disappearing than my children thought I had earned in the past decade. But it felt appropriate somehow. If I was going to vanish, I was going to do it with the same thoroughness and attention to detail that had built my fortune in the first place. The next phase of my transformation began immediately. Caroline had given me assignments that felt like preparing for a theater role where I would play a successful woman instead of pretending to be a struggling one. I needed to research potential new identities, study the social dynamics of wealthy communities, and begin the psychological process of separating myself from the life I was leaving behind. The identity research was surprisingly complex. Caroline explained that simply choosing a new name wasn't sufficient for a complete disappearance. I needed to understand the history and personality that would support my new identity, create believable backstories that would satisfy casual curiosity without inviting deeper investigation, and develop the social skills necessary to navigate environments where wealth was assumed rather than hidden. Think of it as method acting, Caroline had suggested. You need to become someone who has always been comfortable with money, someone who takes luxury for granted, someone whose confidence comes from a lifetime of financial security rather than the anxiety that comes from hiding it. The psychological preparation was the most challenging aspect of the process. For 30 years, I had trained myself to think like someone who worried about money, to make decisions based on budget constraints that didn't actually exist, to present myself as grateful for opportunities rather than entitled to them. Reversing those ingrained patterns required conscious effort and constant attention. I started small, with purchases that reflected my actual financial status rather than my apparent circumstances. Instead of buying generic groceries at discount stores, I shopped at upscale markets where quality was prioritized over price. Instead of wearing clothes until they showed obvious signs of wear, I refreshed my wardrobe with pieces that fit properly and flattered my figure. Instead of driving my reliable but modest Honda, I leased a luxury sedan that reflected my actual ability to afford transportation that was comfortable, rather than merely functional. The difference in how people treated me was immediate and somewhat depressing. Salespeople who had ignored me when I looked like someone stretching a tight budget suddenly became attentive and helpful when I appeared to be someone who could afford their best merchandise without question. Restaurant servers who had treated me like an obligation when I ordered carefully from the value menu became solicitous and accommodating when I ordered wine that cost more than my former apparent weekly grocery budget. Even my neighbors at Riverside Manor began treating me differently as my appearance and possessions gradually shifted upward. The same people who had nodded politely when they thought I was another struggling retiree making due on Social Security began initiating conversations and inviting me to social activities when they noticed my upgraded car and clothing. It was as if I had become a different person simply by allowing my external circumstances to match my internal reality. The most significant change was in my own psychology. After decades of automatically calculating costs and considering budget implications before making any purchase, I found myself thinking like someone who had options rather than limitations. When I wanted something, my first thought was whether I actually wanted it, not whether I could afford it. When I made plans, I considered what would be most enjoyable or convenient, not what would be most economical. The transformation was accelerated by my weekly sessions with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a therapist Caroline had recommended, who specialized in helping people navigate major life transitions. Dr. Walsh's office was in an upscale professional building, and she charged fees that reflected her expertise and the affluence of her typical clientele. For the first time in my adult life, I was paying for premium professional services without justifying the expense or worrying about the impact on my budget. "Tell me about your relationship with money," Dr. Walsh had said during our first session, her voice carrying the kind of professional warmth that invited honesty without judgment. "I've spent 30 years pretending to have less than I actually do," I told her, "and now I'm trying to learn how to live authentically as someone who has more than enough." "What motivated you to hide your wealth for so long?" The question opened floodgates I hadn't realized were straining under pressure. I told Dr. Walsh about my childhood watching my mother's vulnerability after my father's death, about my determination to never depend on anyone else for financial security, about my early business ventures, and the decision to hide their success from Richard during our marriage. I explained how the deception had evolved from practical necessity to protective strategy, and finally to a test of my children's character that they had failed spectacularly. "It sounds like you've been living as two different people," Dr. Walsh observed. "The public Eleanor who struggled and apologized for her circumstances, and the private Eleanor who built substantial wealth through intelligence and determination. Which one feels more authentic to you?" "The private one," I said without hesitation. "But I've been performing the public version for so long that I sometimes forget who I really am underneath the act." "What would it look like to live as your authentic self?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I've never tried." Dr. Walsh helped me understand that my decision to disappear wasn't just about escaping my children's judgment or starting over in a new place. It was about finally claiming the right to be myself completely, without the emotional burden of managing other people's perceptions or protecting them from truths they weren't equipped to handle. "Your children have spent their entire adult lives knowing only the version of you that you thought they needed to see," Dr. Walsh pointed out. "They've never had the opportunity to love or reject the real Eleanor Whitman because they've never met her." "Maybe that's for the best," I said. "The real Eleanor Whitman might be someone they'd like even less than the struggling mother they want to discard. Or she might be someone they'd respect and admire, if they were capable of appreciating intelligence and success in a woman who doesn't fit their preconceptions." The therapy sessions forced me to confront questions I had been avoiding for years. Had I hidden my wealth to protect my children, or to protect myself from their potential rejection? Had I maintained the facade because I believed it was better for them, or because I was afraid of discovering that they valued me only for what I could provide? Had I been testing their character, or avoiding a test of my own worthiness as their mother? The answers were complicated and uncomfortable. I had definitely hidden my wealth initially to protect it, and later to protect them. But somewhere along the way, the deception had become its own kind of security blanket. As long as my children didn't know who I really was, they couldn't reject the real me. Their dismissal of the struggling Eleanor stung, but it didn't threaten my core identity the way rejection of the successful Eleanor would have. "You've been using your false identity as a shield," Dr. Walsh suggested during one of our sessions. "It allowed you to experience their judgment without having to take it personally, because they weren't really judging you. But now they've judged even the diminished version of me and found it lacking," I pointed out. "What does that say about how they'd react to the real version?" "It says they've learned to measure worth by conventional standards rather than recognizing value in unexpected forms. But it doesn't say anything definitive about how they'd respond to honesty." The question haunted me as I continued preparing for my disappearance. Caroline had found several potential locations for my new life, each offering different advantages in terms of climate, culture, and community. Sarasota, Florida, had beautiful beaches and a thriving art scene populated by affluent retiers. La Jolla, California, offered sophisticated luxury and year-round perfect weather. Charleston, South Carolina, combined Southern charm with historical significance and a growing population of successful transplants. I spent weekends visiting these potential new homes, staying in luxury hotels and eating at expensive restaurants, exploring what it would feel like to live openly as someone with substantial wealth. The experience was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. After decades of automatically choosing the least expensive option, I found myself overwhelmed by unlimited choices and the responsibility of deciding what I actually wanted rather than what I could afford. In Sarasota, I toured waterfront condominiums that cost more than most people's houses, marveling at the casual opulence of communities where heated pools and concierge services were standard amenities rather than unimaginable luxuries. The real estate agent, a polished woman named Victoria who clearly specialized in high-end properties, treated me like someone who belonged in these rarefied spaces, discussing seven-figure price tags as if they were reasonable considerations rather than life-changing amounts of money. The owner is motivated to sell quickly, Victoria explained as we toured a penthouse with panoramic views of the Gulf of Mexico. She's relocating to Europe and wants to close within 60 days. For someone with liquid assets, this represents an exceptional opportunity. The casual assumption that I had liquid assets sufficient for such a purchase felt surreal after years of pretending to count every dollar. But Victoria's assumption was accurate. I could afford the penthouse easily, along with the luxury furnishings and waterfront lifestyle it represented. The only question was whether I was psychologically ready to live that openly, after so many years of hidden wealth. In La Jolla, I explored communities where luxury cars lined streets bordered by multi-million-dollar homes, where country club memberships and private beach access were standard rather than aspirational. The wealth was more ostentatious than in Sarasota, but also more casually accepted. People dressed expensively without appearing to try, drove cars that cost more than most annual salaries without seeming to notice their value, discussed travel plans and investment strategies with the kind of casual confidence that comes from never having worried about money. Charleston offered a different flavor of affluence, one rooted in history and tradition rather than pure financial achievement. The wealthy communities there valued lineage and cultural sophistication alongside economic success, creating an environment where new money needed to demonstrate appreciation for old values. It was beautiful and charming, but it also felt like another kind of performance, one where I would need to learn different scripts and social cues to fit in properly. Each location offered advantages, but they also highlighted the magnitude of the transformation I was contemplating. I wasn't just changing my address or revealing my wealth. I was preparing to become someone entirely different, someone who had always been comfortable with money, rather than someone learning to acknowledge it for the first time in her adult life. The logistics of disappearing were surprisingly complex, requiring coordination between multiple professionals and careful timing to avoid raising suspicions. Richard Blackwood was handling the legal aspects, creating new corporate structures for my assets, and establishing residency requirements for my chosen destination. Carolyn Mitchell was managing the practical details, from forwarding services that would redirect my mail to background checks that would ensure my new community was appropriate for someone of my financial status. The most delicate aspect was managing my exit from my current life without creating mysteries that might prompt investigation. My children needed to believe that Eleanor Whitman had made a reasonable decision to relocate somewhere more affordable, not that she had vanished under suspicious circumstances. My neighbors at Riverside Manor needed to see a normal departure, not an abandonment that might suggest foul play or financial irregularities. Carolyn suggested a gradual approach that would satisfy curiosity without inviting scrutiny. You'll tell your children that you've decided to move to a retirement community in Florida where you can afford a better quality of life, she explained. You'll provide them with a plausible address and phone number that will be managed by our service. They'll be able to contact you if they want to, but you'll control when and how you respond. What if they decide to visit? The address will be real, and there will be someone available to explain that you're traveling or temporarily relocated for health reasons. Most adult children who have expressed a desire for distance don't follow up with surprise visits, especially when the relationship has been strained. The plan felt both elaborate and necessary. My children had made it clear that they preferred not to be burdened with my presence, so they were unlikely to investigate my new circumstances closely. As long as I provided a reasonable explanation for my absence and a way for them to contact me if absolutely necessary, they would probably be relieved rather than concerned about my departure. The emotional preparation was more challenging than the logistical arrangements. Despite their recent cruelty, Jessica, Tyler, and Marcus were still my children, people I had loved and protected and worried about for 30 years. Cutting ties with them completely felt like amputating part of myself, even when I knew intellectually that maintaining relationships with people who considered me a burden was ultimately destructive for everyone involved. Dr. Walsh helped me understand that grief was a natural part of the process, even when the loss was voluntary. You're mourning the relationship you hoped to have with your children, not just the relationship you actually had, she explained. It's normal to feel sad about ending connections that mattered to you, even when maintaining them was causing you pain. I keep thinking about who they were as children, I confess, during one of our sessions. Jessica was so curious and creative, always asking questions and building elaborate imaginary worlds. Tyler was gentle and thoughtful, the kind of kid who brought home injured animals and worried about fairness. Marcus was affectionate and funny, always making up jokes and wanting to help with everything. What happened to those children? They grew up in a world that taught them to value success over character, appearance over substance, convenience over commitment. They learned that love is conditional on social acceptability, that family relationships should enhance rather than challenge your self-image, that people who struggle financially are somehow morally deficient. Did you teach them those values? No, I said firmly, but I didn't counteract them effectively either. I was so focused on providing financial security that I didn't pay enough attention to their character development. I assumed that love and example would be sufficient, but I was competing against a culture that rewards superficiality and punishes vulnerability. The realization was painful but liberating. I had failed my children, but not in the way they believed. I hadn't failed to provide for them financially or to sacrifice for their benefit. I had failed to prepare them for the kind of authentic relationships that require seeing past surface appearances to appreciate deeper qualities. I had protected them so thoroughly from financial insecurity that they had never developed empathy for people who struggled, never learned to value resilience over comfort, never understood that circumstances don't determine character. But I had also learned something important about myself through this process. The woman who had built substantial wealth while maintaining a facade of struggle was someone worth knowing and respecting. The mother who had put her children's perceived needs ahead of her own recognition and satisfaction was someone who deserved better than their casual dismissal. The person who had succeeded against odds while hiding that success from people who would have benefited from understanding, it was someone who had earned the right to live authentically, even if that authenticity required leaving familiar people and places behind. As my departure date approached, I found myself looking forward to the future with an anticipation I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since my early 20s, I would be able to make choices based purely on my own preferences and desires. I could wake up each morning in a place I had chosen because I loved it, surrounded by possessions I had selected because they pleased me, interacting with people who knew and appreciated my authentic self, rather than a carefully constructed persona. The woman who would emerge from Eleanor Whitman's disappearance would be someone I was eager to meet, someone who had always existed underneath the protective layers of deception and self-sacrifice. She would be confident without being apologetic, generous without being taken advantage of, successful without hiding her achievements. She would build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation, make choices based on joy rather than fear, live each day as someone who deserved the life she had created, rather than someone who needed to justify her existence to people who had already decided she wasn't worth their time. The test was over, and I had learned everything I needed to know about the people I was leaving behind. Now it was time to discover who I could become when I stopped limiting myself to meet other people's diminished expectations. The morning I officially became someone else, I was standing on the balcony of my new oceanfront condominium in Sarasota, watching dolphins play in the turquoise waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The woman looking out at that view was no longer Eleanor Whitman, the struggling mother from Seattle who had disappointed her children so thoroughly they wished she were dead. She was Elizabeth Warren Sterling, a recently widowed philanthropist who had moved to Florida to start a new chapter after her husband's passing had left her unexpectedly wealthy. The transformation had taken 8 months to complete, 8 months of careful planning and meticulous execution that had erased Eleanor Whitman from existence as thoroughly as if she had actually died. Caroline Mitchell had orchestrated every detail with the precision of a master conductor, from the falsified documents that established Elizabeth's history to the social connections that would introduce her to Sarasota's philanthropic community as someone who belonged among them. Elizabeth Sterling had a past that would satisfy casual curiosity without inviting deeper investigation. She had been married to a successful technology entrepreneur who had sold his company just before his unexpected death from a heart attack, leaving her with substantial assets and the freedom to relocate wherever she chose. She had no children, having devoted herself to supporting her husband's career and various charitable causes. She was intelligent, well-educated, and financially sophisticated, someone who understood investment strategies and tax implications, because she had been actively involved in managing substantial wealth for decades. The backstory felt natural because it contained elements of truth, wrapped in convenient fiction. I had been married to someone in business, though Richard's insurance job was hardly entrepreneurial. I had devoted myself to building wealth, though I had done it for my family rather than purely for charitable purposes. I was financially sophisticated and investment savvy, though I had learned these skills through necessity rather than privilege. The lies were believable because they were built on foundations of authentic experience. My new home reflected the life Elizabeth Sterling was expected to live. The 3-bedroom condominium occupied the entire top floor of an exclusive waterfront building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased panoramic views of the Gulf and the Sarasota skyline. The furnishings were elegant but comfortable, the kind of understated luxury that suggested good taste and substantial resources without appearing ostentatious. Fresh flowers arrived weekly from the building's concierge service, and my refrigerator was stocked with gourmet foods by a personal shopper who knew my preferences without requiring detailed instructions. The most remarkable aspect of my new life was how natural it felt to live without financial constraints. For the first time in 30 years, I bought things because I wanted them, rather than because I could afford them. I chose restaurants based on cuisine and ambiance, rather than price. I made travel plans around interesting destinations rather than budget considerations. I hired services to handle tasks I didn't enjoy, rather than doing everything myself to save money. The psychological shift was more profound than I had expected. Within weeks of settling into my new identity, I found myself thinking differently about money, time, and relationships. Instead of automatically calculating costs and weighing financial implications, I focused on quality and convenience. Instead of accepting substandard service or accommodations because they were affordable, I expected excellence and was willing to pay for it. Instead of feeling grateful for opportunities, I felt entitled to respect and consideration based on my demonstrated success and financial contribution. The change was most noticeable in how other people treated me. When Elizabeth Sterling walked into a restaurant or boutique or professional office, she was greeted with the kind of attention and deference that money commanded. Salespeople assumed she could afford their best merchandise and offered premium service accordingly. Service providers went out of their way to accommodate her preferences and exceed her expectations. Social invitations arrived regularly from organizations and individuals who wanted to cultivate relationships with someone of her apparent means and sophistication. Within 3 months of my arrival in Sarasota, I had been invited to join the Symphony Board, the Art Museum Foundation, and 2 exclusive social clubs that focused on charitable giving and cultural events. The invitations came not because people knew me personally, but because my financial profile and social presentation suggested I would be a valuable addition to their organizations. It was exactly the kind of treatment I had hidden from for 30 years, and experiencing it openly was both intoxicating and sobering. The Symphony Board met monthly in an elegant conference room overlooking Sarasota Bay, where 12 accomplished women discussed fundraising strategies and event planning, with the casual confidence of people accustomed to managing substantial budgets and achieving ambitious goals. They welcomed Elizabeth Sterling warmly, assuming she shared their background of financial privilege and philanthropic commitment. When they discovered I was willing to make significant financial contributions and had practical experience managing complex projects, I became an immediate favorite. "Elizabeth brings such wonderful perspective to our planning," said Margaret Ashworth, the board chairwoman, after my 3rd meeting. "Her suggestions about grant applications and corporate sponsorships are exactly what we need to take our fundraising to the next level." The irony was delicious. These accomplished women were praising Elizabeth Sterling for business acumen and strategic thinking that Eleanor Whitman had developed through decades of building wealth, while hiding that success from her own family. The skills my children had never recognized or appreciated were now being celebrated by strangers who assumed I had always been someone worth listening to. My involvement with the Art Museum Foundation was even more satisfying. The organization was launching a capital campaign to fund a new contemporary art wing, and they needed someone with both financial resources and project management experience to help coordinate the effort. When I volunteered to chair the logistics committee and pledged a six-figure donation to launch the campaign, I was immediately elevated to the inner circle of influence within the organization. "We're so fortunate to have someone with your expertise join us at exactly the right moment," said Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the museum director, as we toured the planned expansion site. "Your background in business development is exactly what we need to make this vision a reality." Business development. The phrase made me smile, because it was accurate even though Dr. Hendricks had no idea what businesses I had actually developed, or how I had acquired the expertise she valued. Eleanor Whitman had spent 25 years building a portfolio of profitable enterprises, but she had hidden that success so thoroughly that even her own children had no idea of her capabilities. Elizabeth Sterling got credit for the same accomplishments, simply because she was willing to acknowledge them openly. The social clubs were the most revealing aspect of my new life, because they showed me how wealth created access to networks and opportunities that remained invisible to people without financial resources. The Sarasota Women's Club met weekly for lunch at the Ritz-Carlton, where conversations flowed seamlessly between vacation plans and investment strategies, charitable causes and family updates, cultural events, and business opportunities. These women had never questioned their right to financial security or apologized for their comfortable circumstances. They planned European river cruises and African safaris with the same casual attention they gave to grocery shopping. They discussed their children's graduate school expenses and wedding costs as routine family investments rather than financial crises. They supported charitable causes not from a sense of obligation, but from genuine enthusiasm for making positive contributions to their community. "Elizabeth, you simply must join us for the art auction next weekend," said Beverly Richardson, whose husband had made a fortune in real estate development. "The pieces are extraordinary this year, and all proceeds benefit the Children's Hospital. I know you'll find something wonderful for your new home." 6 months earlier, Eleanor Whitman would have declined such an invitation, claiming budget constraints or lack of interest in art. Elizabeth Sterling accepted enthusiastically and ended up purchasing a stunning oil painting that cost more than Eleanor's apparent annual income, but fit perfectly in her new dining room. The transaction felt natural and appropriate, rather than extravagant, because Elizabeth Sterling was someone who could afford beautiful things and appreciated quality. The art auction was where I first encountered the Hendersons, a couple whose story would ultimately force me to confront the consequences of my own transformation. James Henderson was a retired pediatric surgeon who had devoted his career to treating children from low-income families, often providing services without compensation when insurance didn't cover necessary procedures. His wife Sarah had been a social worker who specialized in helping families navigate medical and financial crises related to childhood illnesses. They were at the auction not as buyers but as honorees, receiving recognition for decades of charitable work that had improved countless lives without generating personal wealth or social status. They looked slightly uncomfortable in the elegant surroundings, wearing clothes that were clearly their best but obviously not expensive, sitting at a table near the back where they wouldn't attract attention or feel obligated to participate in the bidding. "The Hendersons are remarkable people," Beverly Richardson whispered to me as the auctioneer began highlighting their contributions to the community. "They've given everything to help others, but they've never built any wealth for themselves." Sarah told me they're worried about retirement because they spent so much on their own children's education and never had enough left to save for themselves. The observation hit me with unexpected force. Here were people who had devoted their lives to helping others, who had made genuine sacrifices to improve their community, who had demonstrated the kind of character and commitment that my own children claimed to value. And they were facing financial insecurity in their later years, because they had prioritized service over accumulation, generosity over self-protection, immediate impact over long-term planning. Meanwhile, I was sitting in a room full of wealthy philanthropists, applauding the Hendersons' selflessness while enjoying the benefits of wealth I had accumulated, precisely because I had prioritized financial security over everything else, including honest relationships with my own children. The contrast was uncomfortable and illuminating in ways I hadn't anticipated. After the auction, I approached the Hendersons' table and introduced myself as someone new to the community who was interested in learning about local charitable organizations. Sarah Henderson's face lit up as she described the various causes they supported, her enthusiasm infectious, as she talked about programs that provided medical care for underserved children and support services for struggling families. The need is so much greater than the resources available, Sarah explained. There are families who choose between medical care and basic necessities because they can't afford both. There are children who don't receive necessary treatments because their parents can't navigate the insurance bureaucracy or take time off work for appointments. James nodded gravely. We see the same families repeatedly, cycling through crises because they lack the financial stability to address problems before they become emergencies. A simple ear infection becomes hearing loss because the family couldn't afford the initial doctor visit. A minor learning disability becomes academic failure because the parents couldn't afford testing and tutoring. Their passion was genuine and their knowledge comprehensive, but I could see the weariness in their faces that came from fighting systemic problems with insufficient resources. They had given everything they had to help others, and now they were facing the reality that their generosity had left them vulnerable in their own old age. Have you considered applying for grants to expand your programs? I asked. Constantly, Sarah replied. But most foundations want to fund new initiatives rather than sustaining existing services. And many require matching funds or administrative infrastructure that we simply don't have. What if someone were willing to provide both funding and administrative support? James looked at me curiously. That would be transformative, but we've never found a donor willing to make that kind of comprehensive commitment. I gave them my contact information and suggested they send me detailed information about their current programs and expansion plans. I'm looking for meaningful ways to contribute to this community, I told them. Your work sounds exactly like the kind of impact I want to support. That evening, sitting on my balcony with a glass of wine and the sound of waves providing background music, I found myself thinking about the intersection of wealth and purpose. For 30 years, I had built financial resources while hiding them from people who might have benefited from my success. I had accumulated money for its own sake, for security and independence, and the power to control my own circumstances, but I had never seriously considered using that wealth to address problems beyond my immediate family's needs. Now I had more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, complete freedom to make choices based on personal preference rather than external obligation, and access to a community of people who shared resources to create positive change. For the first time since leaving Seattle, I began to consider what Elizabeth Sterling might accomplish with the assets Eleanor Whitman had accumulated. The Hendersons' proposal arrived 3 days later, a meticulously detailed document that outlined current programs, identified unmet needs, and projected the impact of expanded services with adequate funding. Their existing initiative provided free medical care for uninsured children through a network of volunteer physicians and a small clinic operating on donated space and equipment. With additional resources, they could expand to offer dental care, mental health services, and family support programs that addressed the social determinants that affected children's long-term health outcomes. The budget they requested was substantial but reasonable, certainly within my means, and arguably a better use of resources than the luxury purchases I had been making since my transformation. More importantly, supporting their work would allow me to create meaningful impact while honoring the values I had tried to instill in my own children, even though they had apparently learned to prioritize social status over service. I called the Hendersons and invited them to lunch at my condominium, where we could discuss their proposal privately and develop a relationship that went beyond formal philanthropy. They arrived promptly, clearly impressed by my home, but too polite to comment on the obvious signs of wealth that surrounded them. Your proposal is exactly what I was hoping to find, I told them as we settled on my balcony with coffee and pastries from Sarasota's best bakery. I'm prepared to fund your expansion completely, including operating expenses for at least 5 years. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth in shock, while James leaned forward with the intensity of someone who had learned not to trust good news until he understood its implications completely. That's incredibly generous, James said carefully. But we need to understand your expectations. Most major donors want naming rights, board positions, or significant control over program operations. I want anonymity and impact, I replied. You've already proven you can create meaningful change with limited resources. I'm interested in seeing what you can accomplish when money isn't a constraint. Anonymity? Sarah repeated. Most philanthropists want recognition for their contributions. I'm not most philanthropists, I said. I'm someone who has learned that the most important accomplishments often happen without public acknowledgement. We spent the next 3 hours discussing implementation strategies, timeline considerations, and measurement criteria for evaluating success. The Hendersons had clearly thought deeply about how to scale their impact, but they had always been constrained by fundraising limitations that forced them to think incrementally rather than comprehensively. With adequate funding, we could establish satellite clinics in 3 underserved neighborhoods, Sarah explained, her excitement building as she described possibilities she had only dreamed about. We could hire full-time staff instead of relying entirely on volunteers, which would allow us to provide consistent care and build long-term relationships with families. We could also implement prevention programs, James added. Instead of just treating problems after they develop, we could provide health education, nutrition counseling, and early intervention services that address issues before they become medical emergencies. Their vision was compelling, and their expertise was obvious. But what impressed me most was their understanding of the complex factors that affected children's well-being. They weren't just providing medical care, they were addressing the social and economic circumstances that created health disparities in the first place. How soon could you begin implementation? I asked. With confirmed funding, we could start hiring staff and securing additional clinic space within 60 days, James replied. The demand is already there, and we have relationships with property owners and medical professionals who are waiting for an opportunity to contribute more substantially. Then let's make it happen, I said. My attorney will contact you this week to formalize our partnership and establish the financial structures necessary to support your expansion. The meeting ended with handshakes and expressions of gratitude that felt more meaningful than any social interaction I had experienced since my transformation. For the first time in months, I was using my wealth to create something beyond personal comfort or social acceptance. I was investing in the kind of work that actually mattered, supporting people who had demonstrated genuine commitment to helping others regardless of personal cost. That evening, I called Richard Blackwood to discuss the legal and financial arrangements necessary to support the Hendersons' expansion while maintaining my anonymity. Richard had been managing my assets throughout my transformation, ensuring that my wealth continued to grow even as I spent more freely than ever before. This is a significant commitment, Richard noted after I explained my plans. Are you certain you want to allocate this much to a single charitable initiative? I'm certain that this is the best use of money I've ever made, I replied. These people are creating real impact with minimal resources. Imagine what they could accomplish with adequate funding. And you're comfortable with the anonymity requirement? Most owners at this level expect some recognition or influence over operations. Recognition is the last thing I want, I assured him. I've spent 30 years learning that the most meaningful accomplishments often go unacknowledged by the people who should appreciate them most. 6 weeks later, I was standing in the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Henderson Family Health Center's first satellite clinic, watching Sarah Henderson address a crowd of community members, healthcare professionals, and local officials who had gathered to celebrate the expansion of services that would improve countless lives. I stood in the back of the crowd, just another face among the supporters, watching the impact of resources I had provided without anyone knowing of my involvement. This expansion represents more than just additional clinic space, Sarah was saying, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. It represents hope for families who have struggled to access health care, opportunity for children who deserve the same medical care regardless of their parents' financial circumstances, and proof that this community values the well-being of all its members. The applause was enthusiastic and genuine, filled with the kind of energy that comes from celebrating accomplishments that will create lasting positive change. I found myself thinking about my own children, wondering if they had ever experienced the satisfaction that comes from contributing to something larger than themselves, from using their resources and abilities to address problems that affected people they would never meet. The answer, I realized, was probably not. Jessica, Tyler, and Marcus had achieved conventional success, but they had never learned to find meaning beyond personal advancement. They had comfortable incomes and impressive titles, but they had never discovered the deep satisfaction that comes from creating positive impact rather than just accumulating achievements. That realization led to the most difficult decision I had made since leaving Seattle. Standing in that crowd, watching the celebration of work I had funded anonymously, I understood that my children deserved one final opportunity to discover who they could become if they understood the truth about their mother and themselves. I had disappeared from their lives to escape their judgment and live authentically, but in doing so, I had denied them the chance to learn from their mistakes and grow beyond the superficial values that had led them to reject me. By hiding my success and then vanishing completely, I had protected myself from further pain, but had also ensured that they would never have the opportunity to develop the kind of character that would make them worthy of the wealth I had originally accumulated for their benefit. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Caroline Mitchell and asked her to arrange a meeting with my children, not as Eleanor Whitman, the struggling mother they had rejected, but as Elizabeth Sterling, the successful philanthropist who had built substantial wealth through intelligence and determination. "Are you certain about this?" Caroline asked. "Revealing your new identity carries significant risks, including the possibility that they'll try to reestablish contact or make financial claims. I'm certain that they deserve to understand the consequences of their choices," I replied. "And I deserve to discover whether they're capable of growth and redemption, or if their character is as limited as their recent behavior suggested." Caroline arranged the meeting for the following month, scheduling it in a neutral location, where I would have control over the circumstances and could leave easily if the encounter became unpleasant. She would present me as a philanthropist researching family dynamics and wealth transfer issues, someone who had heard about their family situation and wanted to understand their perspective on intergenerational relationships and financial responsibility. The anticipation was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time in nearly a year, I would see my children again, but they would be meeting someone they had never encountered before. Elizabeth Sterling was confident, successful, and financially independent, someone who commanded respect rather than pity, someone who contributed to her community rather than apologizing for her circumstances. The woman they would meet was everything Eleanor Whitman had always been underneath the facade they had never bothered to see past. The question was whether Jessica, Tyler, and Marcus were capable of recognizing worth when it was presented honestly, or if they were so committed to their superficial judgments that they couldn't appreciate value that didn't conform to their preconceptions. 3 weeks before the scheduled meeting, I received a phone call that changed everything. Richard Blackwood's voice was grim as he delivered news that transformed my carefully planned confrontation into something much more urgent and painful. "Eleanor, I've received some information about your family that you need to know before you make any decisions about contact," he said. "Tyler has been hospitalized with a serious heart condition. According to my sources, the prognosis is uncertain, and the medical expenses aren't fully covered by his insurance." The news hit me like a physical blow. My son, the gentle child who had worried about fairness and brought home injured animals, was facing a life-threatening illness while I lived in luxury, using my wealth to help strangers while remaining hidden from my own family. "How serious is it?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Serious enough that he may need a heart transplant, which could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. His siblings are apparently struggling to coordinate care and manage the financial implications." For the first time since my transformation, I felt the full weight of my decision to disappear from my children's lives. While I had been enjoying my freedom and finding meaning through anonymous philanthropy, my son had been facing a medical crisis that threatened both his life and his financial stability. The wealth I had accumulated for my children's security was sitting untouched while they struggled with exactly the kind of emergency I had always planned to help them navigate. I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity and certainty. The confrontation I had planned, the test of their character and growth, would have to wait. My son needed help, and providing that help was more important than protecting my new identity or teaching anyone lessons about consequences and redemption. "Richard, I need you to set up an anonymous fund to cover Tyler's medical expenses," I said. "Complete anonymity, structured so that the payments come through a foundation that can't be traced back to me." "Eleanor, are you sure about this? It will require careful planning to maintain your privacy while providing substantial financial support." "I'm sure. My son is sick, and I have the resources to help him. Nothing else matters right now." Within 48 hours, Richard had established the Harrison Medical Foundation, a charitable organization focused on providing financial assistance to families facing catastrophic medical expenses. Tyler received notification that he had been selected as a recipient of comprehensive support that would cover all treatment costs, including experimental procedures and recovery expenses that weren't typically covered by insurance. The foundation's letter explained that he had been recommended by a healthcare professional who was impressed by his character and determination, and that the foundation preferred to remain anonymous to protect both donors and recipients from unwanted attention. The funding would continue until his complete recovery, regardless of how long treatment required or how expensive it became. I monitored his progress through carefully maintained channels, watching from a distance as Tyler underwent surgery, began recovery, and gradually returned to health, with the security of knowing that financial concerns wouldn't affect his medical decisions. The relief I felt watching him recover was profound and immediate, confirming that my love for my children transcended the hurt and disappointment of their recent behavior. But the experience also clarified something important about my priorities and values. The wealth I had accumulated was most meaningful when it was used to help people I cared about, even when they didn't know I was helping them. The satisfaction I had found in supporting the Hendersons' work was amplified when applied to my own family's needs, even though they would never know the source of their good fortune. As Tyler's health stabilized and he returned to work, I found myself reconsidering my plans for the confrontation that would reveal my transformation to my children. The test I had planned seemed less important than the opportunity to reconnect with them, as people who might have learned something from their recent experiences with vulnerability and uncertainty. Perhaps Tyler's illness had taught them something about the value of family support and unconditional love. Perhaps watching their brother face mortality had reminded Jessica and Marcus that relationships matter more than social status or financial success. Perhaps they had grown during this crisis in ways that would make them more receptive to understanding their mother's choices and their own mistakes. Or perhaps they hadn't changed at all, and revealing myself would only expose me to further disappointment and rejection. The only way to find out was to take the risk I had been planning all along, but with a different motivation and a deeper understanding of what I hoped to accomplish. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in downtown Seattle, at a hotel where Elizabeth Sterling was ostensibly staying while conducting research for a book about family wealth and intergenerational relationships. Jessica, Tyler, and Marcus had agreed to participate because they had been told that their family's experience with economic diversity and sibling relationships made them ideal interview subjects for a study about how financial circumstances affect family dynamics. I spent the morning preparing for an encounter that would determine whether my children were capable of the kind of growth and understanding that would make them worthy of knowing the truth about their mother's success and their own opportunities. The woman they would meet was confident, accomplished, and financially independent, but she was also someone who had learned that wealth without love was meaningless, that success without family was hollow, that independence without connection was ultimately unsatisfying. For the first time in nearly a year, Eleanor Whitman and Elizabeth Sterling would become the same person, revealing the truth that had been hidden for 30 years, and testing whether love could survive honesty, whether family could transcend judgment, whether forgiveness was possible when it required acknowledging fundamental mistakes about worth and character. The moment of truth was finally arriving, and I was ready to discover who my children really were underneath the disappointment and entitlement they had shown their struggling mother. Elizabeth Sterling was about to meet Jessica, Tyler, and Marcus, and their response would determine whether Eleanor Whitman's family could be rebuilt on a foundation of truth rather than deception. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.